Charles Bronson found out his neighbor was abusing his wife. The confrontation ended a marriage. The screaming started at 2:30 a.m. on a Sunday night in May 1977. Charles Bronson was lying in bed at his Malibu home, reading a script for his next film, when he heard a woman's voice coming from the house next door. "Please, Rick, stop. You're hurting me." Charles set down his script and listened. His neighbor, Rick Henderson, was a successful real estate developer who lived in the mansion next to Charles's property. Charles had met Rick a few times at neighborhood gatherings. He seemed like a typical wealthy Los Angeles businessman. Confident, charming, the kind of man who talked loudly about his golf game and drove expensive cars. Rick's wife Susan was quieter, more reserved. She was maybe 35, attractive in a fragile way, with the kind of careful makeup that Charles had learned to recognize from his years in Hollywood, makeup designed to hide something. "I said I was sorry." Susan's voice carried across the night air. "I didn't mean to embarrass you at the party. You made me look like an idiot in front of my business partners." Rick's voice was slurred with alcohol and rage. "Do you have any idea how much money that deal was worth?" Charles got out of bed and walked to his bedroom window. The Henderson house was about 50 yards away, separated from Charles's property by a low stone wall and some landscaping. Through their kitchen window, he could see two figures, Rick towering over Susan, his body language aggressive and threatening. Then Charles heard the sound that made his blood run cold. A sharp crack, followed by Susan's cry of pain. Charles had grown up in a neighborhood where domestic violence was common but rarely discussed. His own father had never laid a hand on his mother, but Charles had seen the aftermath in other families, the broken women, the children who learned that love came with bruises, the cycle of violence that passed from one generation to the next. He put on his clothes and walked outside. The Henderson property was gated, but Charles had been invited over for barbecues before and knew the code for the side entrance. He let himself in and walked quietly toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Rick grabbing Susan by the shoulders, shaking her while he screamed in her face. Susan was crying, trying to pull away, but Rick was much bigger and stronger. Charles knocked on the kitchen door. Hard. The screaming stopped immediately. Charles could see Rick and Susan freeze, both looking toward the door with expressions of panic and fear. "Rick. It's Charles Bronson. Open up." There was a long pause, then footsteps. The door opened, and Rick appeared, trying to look casual despite being disheveled and clearly drunk. "Charles. Hey, buddy. What brings you over so late?" Charles looked past Rick to where Susan was standing in the kitchen, holding a dish towel against her mouth. Even in the dim light, Charles could see that her lip was bleeding. "I heard screaming. Thought someone might need help." "Oh, that." Rick laughed nervously. "Susan just had a little accident. Slipped in the shower earlier and hit her mouth on the faucet. She was just upset about it. You know how women get." Charles looked directly at Susan. "Is that what happened, Mrs. Henderson?" Susan's eyes darted between Charles and her husband. "Yes," she said quietly. "I slipped. I'm fine." But Charles could see the fear in her eyes, the way she instinctively stepped back when Rick moved toward her. "Well," Charles said, "accidents happen. But Susan, if you ever need help with anything, anything at all, you know where I live." The message was clear. Charles was letting Susan know she had an ally if she needed one. Rick's face darkened. "Thanks for checking on us, Charles, but we're fine. Just fine." Charles left, but he didn't go home. Instead, he sat in his car at the end of the Henderson driveway, watching the house. About an hour later, he saw Rick's silhouette in the kitchen window, gesticulating angrily while Susan cowered nearby. The screaming didn't start again that night, but Charles knew it would. Men like Rick Henderson didn't change just because a neighbor had knocked on their door. Over the next few weeks, Charles paid closer attention to the Henderson house. He noticed that Susan rarely left the property. When she did go out, it was usually for quick trips to the grocery store, and she always wore sunglasses and long sleeves, even on warm days. Charles also started noticing Rick's pattern. He traveled frequently for business, usually for 3 or 4 days at a time. When Rick was gone, Susan seemed different. She would sit by their pool, tend to her garden, occasionally wave to Charles if she saw him outside. But when Rick came home, Susan disappeared. She would retreat into the house and wouldn't emerge until he left again. The next incident happened 3 weeks later. Charles was hosting a small dinner party on his patio when he heard the familiar sounds from next door, shouting, crying, the crash of something being thrown. His guests tried to pretend they didn't hear anything, but Charles couldn't ignore it. He excused himself and walked to the stone wall that separated the properties. "Susan," he called out. "Everything okay over there?" The noise stopped immediately. "Everything's fine." Rick's voice called back. "Just watching a movie. Action flick. You know how loud they get." But Charles had been in enough action movies to know the difference between movie violence and real violence. Movies didn't make women cry like that. The next morning, Charles saw Susan in her garden, wearing long sleeves despite the 85-degree weather. When she saw him, she quickly went inside. That afternoon, Charles made a phone call to Detective Janet Morgan, a friend he'd met during research for one of his films. Morgan specialized in domestic violence cases. "Janet, I need some advice. I think my neighbor is beating his wife, but she won't admit it. What can I do? Without the victim's cooperation, there's not much the law can do. We need her to file a complaint, or we need to witness the abuse directly. What about if I see it happening? Then you call 911 immediately." "But Charles, be careful. Domestic violence situations are dangerous for everyone involved, including Good Samaritans." 2 weeks later, Charles got his chance. He was working in his garden around sunset when he heard Rick's car pull into the driveway next door. Through the landscaping, Charles could see Rick getting out of his BMW, clearly drunk and agitated. Charles positioned himself behind a large hedge where he could see the Henderson house without being spotted. Rick burst through the front door, already shouting. "Where the hell is dinner? I told you I'd be home at 6. "I'm sorry," Susan's voice was barely audible. "I thought you said 7. I can have something ready in 20 minutes. 20 minutes? I'm hungry now." Charles heard the sound of dishes breaking, then Susan's scream. He pulled out his cell phone, a rare device in 1977 that he'd acquired for emergencies, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "This is Charles Bronson at 1247, Canyon Drive in Malibu. I'm witnessing a domestic violence incident at the house next door. The address is 1251, Canyon Drive. I can see a man assaulting a woman through their window. Units are on the way, sir. Stay on the line and tell me what you see." Charles watched through the window as Rick grabbed Susan by the hair and slammed her against the refrigerator. He just threw her against an appliance. "She's on the ground now. Sir, do not intervene. Wait for the officers to arrive." But Charles wasn't going to wait. He'd seen enough. He walked to the Henderson front door and rang the doorbell repeatedly. When no one answered, he tried the handle. The door was unlocked. "Rick!" Charles called out as he entered the house. "This is Charles Bronson. I'm coming in." He found Rick and Susan in the kitchen. Susan was on the floor, blood streaming from her nose. Rick was standing over her, his fist raised for another blow. "Get out of my house!" Rick screamed when he saw Charles. "Back away from her, Rick. This is none of your business. This is between me and my wife." Charles stepped closer. "Not anymore. I called the police. They're on their way. Rick's face went pale. You had no right. I had every right. You're beating a woman who can't defend herself. Rick looked around frantically, then seemed to make a decision. He lunged at Charles, swinging a wild punch that Charles easily avoided. Charles had learned to fight in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and Rick Henderson was just a drunk businessman who thought money made him tough. Charles grabbed Rick by the shirt and slammed him against the wall. You ever put your hands on her again, you'll answer to me. And trust me, Rick, you don't want that. Police sirens were getting closer. Susan, Charles said without taking his eyes off Rick, the police are here. Tell them what happened. Tell them the truth. For the first time in years, Susan Henderson told someone the truth about her marriage. Rick Henderson was arrested and charged with domestic assault. The case made local news, real estate developer arrested after Charles Bronson witnesses assault, and suddenly everyone in their wealthy neighborhood was talking about domestic violence. But the real story was what happened to Susan. With Charles's help, she filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order against Rick. Charles also connected her with a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases and helped her find a safe place to stay while the legal proceedings moved forward. Why are you helping me? Susan asked Charles during one of their conversations. You barely know me. Susan, I grew up around violence. I saw what it did to families, to children. I swore I'd never ignore it when I saw it happening to someone else. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. Rick fought it viciously, hiring expensive lawyers and trying to paint Susan as an unstable woman who was lying about the abuse. But Charles's testimony, combined with medical records and photographs of Susan's injuries, made Rick's case impossible to defend. Susan was awarded half of Rick's considerable assets, including their Malibu house. Rick was ordered to complete anger management counseling and stay away from Susan permanently. But more importantly, Susan began to heal. With the help of therapy and the support of friends she'd been isolated from during her marriage, she started to rebuild her life. In 1985, 8 years after that night in the kitchen, Susan Henderson, now Susan Mitchell, having reclaimed her maiden name, opened a women's shelter in downtown Los Angeles. The shelter provided safe housing and legal assistance to women escaping domestic violence. At the shelter's opening ceremony, Susan spoke about the night that changed her life. For 6 years, I lived in fear, she told the assembled crowd of donors and volunteers. I believed that no one would help me, that no one would believe me, that I was trapped forever. She looked out at the audience, which included Charles and his family. But one man refused to look away. One man decided that what was happening to me mattered. He didn't just save my life, he showed me that I was worth saving. Charles Bronson continued to support Susan's shelter for the rest of his life, both financially and by speaking out about domestic violence. His involvement helped bring attention to an issue that was often hidden in wealthy communities. When Charles died in 2003, Susan spoke at his memorial service. People knew Charles as a tough guy from the movies, she said. But I knew him as a man who used his toughness to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. He taught me that real strength isn't about intimidating people, it's about standing up for people who are being intimidated. Today, the Susan Mitchell Women's Center has helped over 3,000 women escape domestic violence. Above the entrance is a plaque that reads, "In honor of Charles Bronson, who proved that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to mind your own business." That's the Charles Bronson story that matters. Not the vigilante movies or the stone-faced characters, but the man who heard a woman screaming next door and decided he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to help. Because sometimes being a neighbor means more than just living next door. Sometimes it means being willing to step in when someone needs help, even when it's dangerous, even when it's not your problem, even when it would be easier to just turn up the television and pretend you didn't hear anything. Charles Bronson never pretended he didn't hear anything. And Susan Mitchell is alive today because he didn't.